I never set out to reconstruct a civilization that, according to official textbooks, never existed. I had no intention of challenging history for the sake of debate, no desire to revive forgotten empires or invent alternative timelines. What compelled me to begin this investigation was something much quieter, subtler, and therefore far more dangerous to the familiar picture of the world. It was time. More precisely, our perception of time. When you spend enough months studying architectural remnants, industrial artifacts, and photographic evidence from the mid-19th century to the early 20th, a strange feeling begins to grow inside you. It's not a sudden epiphany, but a slow accumulation of discrepancies. You start noticing not only what's present in the images, but also what's absent from them. The absence of explanations. The absence of transitional stages of development. The absence of traces of trial and error. Buildings stand, and their scale and complexity far exceed the technical capabilities attributed to that era. Infrastructure persists beneath our modern cities, and contemporary engineers still cannot fully map it onto their charts. Photographs capture a world that appears frighteningly organized, coordinated, and technologically precise, far more so than the narrative of a primitive, pre-industrial society allows us to believe. At some point, this discomfort becomes impossible to ignore. I realized something deeply unsettling. The history we've been told about everyday life in the 1800s physically does not match the evidence still embedded in our pavements. It doesn't align with the height of ceilings, the precision of canals, the global synchronicity of architectural styles. So I stopped asking the question that all alternative history researchers debate. I stopped asking, did Tartaria exist? Instead, I posed a question that far more destabilizes the official version. What was everyday life really like in the civilization that left behind these structures? This investigation is not about kings or empire borders. It's an attempt to understand the routine, movement, labor, housing, transport, trade, communication, energy. It's a look at those very unglamorous mechanisms of life in a period described to us as technologically limited and socially fragmented. According to official history, the 19th century was a time of deprivation. Most people lived in cramped, poorly heated homes. Travel was slow and exhausting. Communication depended on the speed of a horse. Construction relied on simple tools and local manual labor. Society progressed gradually, in fits and starts, driven by isolated lone inventors. But when you look at what actually remains, a different picture emerges. Roads are too perfectly leveled. Canals are too precisely engineered. Buildings are too mathematically consistent across continents. This doesn't look like improvisation. It looks like coordination. It's not primitive survival struggle. It's organized movement. Not isolation, but integration. Not simplicity, but systems whose purpose we've forgotten how to recognize. Let's set aside abstract debates for a moment and imagine something more tangible. Let's envision how a day actually unfolded within these physical spaces that still surround us. Imagine waking at dawn in a city that didn't vanish, but was merely reinterpreted. You wake not in a romanticized past, but in a real physical space that has survived to our days. You rise in a room whose ceiling height defies any modern economic logic. 4, 5, sometimes 6 meters. air volumes that cannot be justified by simple considerations of heating or aesthetics. Windows stretching almost from floor to the very top seem designed not just for lighting, but for managing airflows, regulating pressure, and distributing light. These are not architectural extravagances, these are ecological calculations. The plasterwork around you is executed with such precision that modern craftsmen cannot replicate it without enormous costs. Geometric patterns repeat with mathematical accuracy, not in one building, but in thousands of buildings, in dozens of cities separated by oceans. We're asked to believe that these structures were built by independent contractors in different countries using primitive tools and somehow all arrived at identical solutions. Ask yourself, how is this possible? Morning light enters through windows positioned not randomly, but deliberately aligned to solar angles calculated with seasonal variations in mind. The building itself responds to natural forces, wind, sun, water movement, in ways modern constructions hardly can. You dress in clothing we see in old photographs. It's complex, multi-layered, structured. This is not peasant homespun improvisation. The textiles show signs of industrial-scale production. Cotton from India, silk from Asia, wool from Australia, all available in provincial towns thousands of miles from production centers, and all arriving with suspicious regularity. At this moment, the question becomes inevitable. What infrastructure made this possible? You step out onto the street, and it immediately challenges the official narrative. These are not muddy paths or chaotically laid cobblestones. These are precisely leveled boulevards with drainage systems so perfect they function today, more than 100 years later. Storm drains connecting to underground networks stretching for miles. Sewer systems rivaling modern engineering solutions. Pressurized water mains supplying entire cities. All this supposedly built in a few decades, across the world, on the same principles. The streets themselves reveal intent. They are too wide for simple horse-drawn transport, too perfectly aligned to cardinal directions to be coincidence. City after city features the same layout. Grand boulevards radiating from central points create geometric patterns visible only from above. Star forts, radial designs, mathematical precision implying centralized planning on scales that, we're told, didn't exist then. This is not organic growth. This is design. And movement along these streets makes the official explanation impossible. Photographs from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s show streets teeming with activity. But this is not medieval chaos. This is organized flow. Trams on rails, cable systems requiring massive underground equipment, omnibuses on fixed routes implying schedules, coordination, and administrative control. Transport networks appear before us fully formed and perfected. Street railways in hundreds of cities by the 80s of the 19th century. Cable cars, elevated trains. All this requires geodetic survey precision, engineering expertise, and centralized planning that textbooks say didn't exist then. Who planned this? Who standardized it? Who maintained it? Historical records are silent. Canals deepen the mystery. Beyond famous waterways, there are thousands of smaller canals linking cities, towns, and industrial centers. Precisely engineered networks with lock systems, water level management, and seasonal flow regulation. The scale is staggering. The British canal system at its peak spanned thousands of miles of navigable waterways built in roughly 60 years, all compatible, all with exact gradients. This was not primitive infrastructure. This was systemic design. And it required extraordinary knowledge. Water rose uphill, levels synchronized across regions, flows regulated by season. Yet history records no learning curve, no period of trial and error. Fully formed systems appear almost simultaneously on different continents. The same pattern appears in overland trade. Caravan routes were not wandering trails. They were structured movement corridors with stations spaced at precise intervals. Caravanserais in Persia, Central Asia, and Anatolia share identical architectural features. Water supply systems, storage facilities, defensive walls, all built to unified standards. This was not merchant improvisation. This was administration. Here we encounter evidence that most historians prefer to ignore. Airships, patent applications, engineering journals, newspaper reports of air shows, photographs showing rooftop structures on buildings with no obvious purpose unless they were mooring masts or landing platforms for airships. I don't claim vast fleets or routine aerial commerce existed, but the evidence points to experiments, developments, and limited deployment of lighter-than-air transport that was systematically erased from mainstream historical narrative. Why? Consider the implications. Even limited aerial communication changes everything regarding information distribution, reconnaissance, and elite mobility. It implies a level of technological sophistication incompatible with the primitive past narrative. The buildings themselves hint at this. Rooftop structures without visible function, tall masts on government buildings, architectural elements that make sense only as docking points. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Reports from World's Fairs, Paris, Chicago, describe aerial demonstrations, tethered balloons carrying passengers, discussions of future navigation. Then, after 1900, these mentions nearly vanish. Not because the technology failed, but because the documentation of technical progress shifted. Something changed. Why does the historical record show such an abrupt break? Everyday life unfolded inside these structures, and here the mystery becomes deepest. Buildings reveal functions we've been taught to ignore. These are not just homes or factories. These are spaces designed for specific purposes we no longer recognize. Basements extend far deeper than needed for simple storage. Multi-level underground chambers with brick vaults, drainage systems, mysterious equipment mounts. Official history calls them cellars, but the engineering is too deliberate. Airtight chambers, pressure-resistant walls, pipe connection points leading to unknown destinations. Main floors show traces of built-in systems that were removed and forgotten. Wall cavities too large for simple utilities. Shaft systems spanning multiple floors. Central courtyards with glass ceilings that seem like light wells, but designed with such precision they served additional purposes. Upper floors pose their own questions. Ceiling heights that decrease with ascent. Why? Ventilation systems far more complex than needed for basic air circulation. Rooftop structures with astronomical alignments, implying observation or measurement. And everywhere, ornament. This is not decorative excess. These are mathematical patterns, geometric progressions, symbolic systems repeating across continents. Official history dismisses it as architectural style, but the execution precision implies meaning we've lost. The rhythm of everyday labor reveals the most unsettling anomalies. Factories in photographs are not primitive workshops. They are massive structures with floor-to-ceiling equipment, precision machines, and assembly systems requiring hundreds of coordinated workers. Production scale appears instantly, without transition. Textile mills in New England, producing millions of yards of fabric annually by the 30s of the 19th century. Steelworks in Germany, operating at industrial scale by the 50s. Ceramic factories in England, glassworks in Bohemia, chemical plants in France, all emerging within decades, all requiring expertise supposedly unavailable. The workforce is a separate puzzle. Photographs show formally dressed workers at these facilities operating complex machinery with clear proficiency. Where did the training come from? How did thousands of workers across industries simultaneously acquire specialized knowledge? Official history speaks of the Industrial Revolution, gradual progress, lone inventors, but physical evidence suggests otherwise. Inherited systems, repurposed infrastructure, technologies deployed, not invented from scratch. Inside these factories, you find equipment that shouldn't exist. Metalworking lathes with tolerances in thousandths of an inch. Hydraulic systems operating at pressures modern engineers respect. Electricity-generating equipment appearing decades before Edison. Chemical processes requiring molecular structure knowledge supposedly unknown. And coordination between enterprises. Standardized parts emerging in the 50s, interchangeable components made in different cities and countries but fully compatible. Assembly line methods arising simultaneously across industries. All this requires systemic thinking, centralized planning, and information distribution that, we're told, didn't exist. The evidence points to something far beyond individual inventiveness. Everyday commerce in these cities reveals the deepest mystery. Markets operating with price coordination across continents. Goods arriving thousands of miles away with predictable regularity. Currency exchange systems handling dozens of monetary standards. Credit instruments, bills of exchange, commercial contracts implying complex financial infrastructure. This was no barter. No simple trade. This was integrated commerce requiring information technologies that, we're told, arrived only with telegraph and telephone. Yet records show coordinated pricing, synchronized goods movement, arbitrage across ocean distances, all before electronic communication. How? The market buildings themselves tell part of the story. Grand edifices with climate control systems, cooling capabilities, storage for specific goods. Not primitive stalls, but organized exchanges with administrative apparatus, regulations, and standardized measures. The deeper I dug, the more evidence of commercial networks operating with clockwork precision. Tea from China arriving in London on schedule. Cotton from America, processed in Manchester mills. Grain from Ukraine feeding European cities. All moving through systems requiring coordination seemingly impossible without modern tech. And financial instruments, letters of credit accepted across empires, insurance contracts covering global shipments, investment syndicates funding projects on multiple continents. All this requires trust, verification, and enforcement mechanisms, implying institutional structures we're taught didn't exist. The coordination problem becomes mathematically inexplicable by traditional means. The question of societal organization opens new layers of mystery. Official history portrays the 19th century as emerging democracy, aristocratic decline, middle-class rise. But physical evidence, buildings, infrastructure, massive project coordination, suggests administrative capabilities far beyond what elected governments supposedly possessed. Who planned the cities? Who coordinated canal networks? Who standardized railways? Who enforced commercial rules? Buildings offer clues. Administrative complexes in every major city, imposing structures with documentation rooms, communication hubs, assembly halls. Not primitive town halls, but complex bureaucratic centers implying vast state apparatus. Records everywhere mention membership organizations, trade guilds, professional societies, fraternal orders, philosophical associations. All operating internationally, all connected, all apparently coordinating across political borders. The pattern suggests parallel power structures, not replacing official governments, but operating alongside, coordinating systems that made daily life function. Standardization bodies, professional certifications, technical protocols. These left minimal documentation. Their activities were internal matters, but their influence shows in uniformity of outcomes. Identical building codes across countries. Standardized engineering practices on multiple continents. Coordinated responses to technical challenges. When you map these networks, trace connections between cities, institutions, projects, a picture of organizational capabilities emerges that official history cannot explain. Everyday cultural life poses questions historians prefer to avoid. Ideas spread too quickly. Architectural styles appear simultaneously in distant cities. Musical trends emerge across countries within months. Literary movements, philosophical concepts, scientific theories distribute across continents with suspicious speed, before telegraph, telephone, wireless. Official explanation cites postal systems, traveling intellectuals, printed journals. But the timeline doesn't fit. Synchronicity is too precise. Study World's Fairs. Massive international events coordinating dozens of countries, showcasing technologies supposedly in early development, demonstrating organizational feats requiring years of planning and connectivity. The Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851, Paris 1889, Chicago 1893, all involve global coordination on impossible scales. Buildings for these fairs reveal the deepest mystery. Temporary structures supposedly erected hastily, designed with permanent precision. Crystal Palace, nearly 1 million square feet of glass and iron, built in months, then dismantled and relocated. Paris Fair edifices, complex buildings spanning hundreds of acres, appearing like magic, then vanishing from records. Where did this expertise come from? Where did it go? Cultural products show the same pattern. Sheet music published simultaneously in New York, London, Paris, Vienna. Books appearing in multiple languages within weeks. Fashion trends crossing oceans before photographs could document them. Scientific discoveries announced in different countries on the same day. Evidence points to information distribution systems we're taught didn't exist. When the workday ended and people returned home, they entered spaces filled with technologies that shouldn't have existed. Gas lighting systems requiring underground distribution networks. Indoor plumbing connected to pressurized water systems. Heating with thermostatic control. Ventilation networks regulating air quality. All supposedly primitive, yet designed with complexity modern buildings struggle to match. Gas systems alone pose staggering questions. How to safely distribute combustible gas through hundreds of miles of underground pipes. How to regulate pressure in networks serving thousands of buildings. How to manage seasonal demand fluctuations. How to prevent leaks and explosions. Yet, by the 50s of the 19th century, major cities had these systems fully operational. Not experimentally, but as mature infrastructure serving entire populations. Water supply systems demonstrate even more intricate engineering. Reservoir construction requiring geological surveys. Aqueducts spanning dozens of miles. Filtration plants using chemical processes. Distribution networks with pressure regulation. Flow control, contamination prevention, all emerging within decades in dozens of cities on the same principles. Inside homes, coordination evidence continues. Standardized fixtures, compatible fittings, interchangeable parts, all pointing to production coordination, distribution systems, and commercial networks operating at industrial scale before the supposed Industrial Revolution matured. Domestic space reveals the final impossibility. How could ordinary people on ordinary jobs afford these technologies? How did infrastructure requiring massive capital serve the middle class? How did systems needing constant maintenance and technical support become ubiquitous? The economics don't work unless something fundamental is missing from our understanding. After dark, the city transformed. Street lighting appeared far earlier than official history admits. Not primitive oil lamps, organized systems with central control, standardized fixtures, coordinated maintenance. By the 60s of the 19th century, major cities had street lighting networks covering miles of boulevards. Energy sources raise immediate questions. Gas required underground distribution. Electricity needed generation capacity, grids, voltage regulation. Arc lighting required precision equipment, carbon electrodes, current control. All supposedly embryonic, yet deployed at urban scale. Photographs from the period show nighttime activity incompatible with primitive lighting. Streets bustling after dark. Commercial districts operating late. Public spaces lit for safety and navigation. All requiring infrastructure investments seeming economically impossible. The buildings themselves illuminate mysteries. Windows glowing with internal light from systems we're told were barely experimental. Entire facades lit for display or orientation. Rooftop lights visible for miles, implying navigational or signaling purposes. Who coordinated this? Who funded it? Who possessed the technical knowledge to deploy electrical systems decades before Edison, Tesla, and Westinghouse supposedly pioneered them? The pattern repeats. Mature systems appear without documented development, spread without visible diffusion mechanisms, operate with seemingly inherited rather than invented expertise. This brings us to the central question this investigation cannot evade. What happened to the knowledge? Not just technical knowledge, engineering principles, or production methods. What happened to the conceptual frameworks that made these systems possible? To the understanding of organizing cities, moving populations, distributing goods, coordinating commerce across continents? The rupture is striking. Study engineering journals from the 80s of the 19th century, and you'll find complex discussions on hydraulic systems, atmospheric pressure applications, energy distribution networks. By 1920, these discussions nearly vanish, replaced by other paradigms, assumptions, technologies, as if the entire knowledge base was systematically supplanted. Construction methods show the same pattern. 19th century structures employ techniques we can no longer economically reproduce. Not for lack of tools, but because we've lost systemic knowledge of material properties, structural principles, integrated design thinking that made these buildings possible. Infrastructure reveals this most clearly. We excavate basements and find network systems we don't understand. Demolish buildings and uncover mechanical apparatus we can't identify. Study water management systems and acknowledge engineering complexity we struggle to duplicate. This was not primitive technology gradually improving. These were sophisticated knowledges systematically forgotten. Ask yourself, why? Why were advanced capabilities abandoned? Why were efficient systems replaced by inferior alternatives? Why were coordinated networks dismantled for fragmented solutions? The official narrative offers no answers because it denies the premise. We're told there was nothing to lose. Progress moved linearly forward, each generation building on the last. But physical evidence flatly contradicts this. Imagine living through this transition. Growing up in cities with comprehensive infrastructure, coordinated systems, complex technologies, then watching them dismantled, replaced, forgotten. Seeing canal networks abandoned for railways, gas systems swapped for less efficient electrical grids. Architectural knowledge lost as standardized construction replaces integrated design. Early 20th century records contain hints, complaints of declining services, nostalgia for better times, mentions of capabilities within living memory, but now inaccessible. Elderly residents recall when streets were cleaner, water purer, air less polluted, when systems ran seamlessly without constant intervention, when cities seemed designed, not accidentally accumulated. But these voices were marginalized, dismissed as romantic memories of an imagined past. The progress narrative demanded continuous improvement. Any suggestion of lost capabilities threatened the foundational story of modernity. So knowledge faded, skills vanished. Holistic urban design was replaced by narrow, specialized solutions. Within one generation, memory was erased enough that we could look at inherited infrastructure and claim we built it ourselves. View intricate engineering as primitive. Insist coordinated systems arose by chance. The rhythm of forgetting has its own momentum. Once begun, it accelerates. Today, you can still see the evidence if you know where to look. Buildings not renovated beyond recognition. Underground infrastructure exposed in construction projects. Canal systems visible in satellite images. Street layouts revealing geometric patterns from above. Walk old cities with this perspective, and anomalies become overwhelming. Building after building demonstrates capabilities mismatched to the official timeline. Infrastructure after infrastructure reveals coordination that shouldn't be. System after system shows complexity we're told came later. The pattern is consistent. What remains is more advanced than what replaced it. 19th century railway stations, with acoustics modern architects struggle to achieve. Victorian water systems with pressure regulation, modern infrastructure can't match. Industrial buildings with natural climate control, our mechanized systems can't replicate. This is not nostalgia. This is measurable, documented physical proof that the narrative of continuous progress is fundamentally incomplete. Something existed, something complex, something coordinated, something we've been taught never to believe. And the question becomes inevitable. What else have we forgotten? I began this investigation expecting to document everyday life in a historical period I thought I understood. Instead, I uncovered a mystery deepening with every archive visited, photograph studied, building measured. What was life like in the cities we call Tartarian? The evidence suggests it was more coordinated than we've been told, more complex than official history admits, more interconnected than available technologies allowed. People moved through systems we can barely comprehend, worked with technologies we've forgotten how to reproduce, lived in spaces designed for purposes we no longer recognize. Then something changed. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but systematically and deliberately. Knowledge faded. Systems were dismantled. Infrastructure abandoned or repurposed. Understanding of how it all worked together sank into obscurity. Within a few generations, we couldn't remember. We looked at what remained and invented new stories to explain it. Stories fitting our preferred narrative of progress and steady advancement from primitive to modern. But the buildings remember. The streets remember. Canals, railways, underground networks, all remember a different history. A history of coordination without communication tech. Organization without electronic systems. Sophisticated engineering without modern tools. Global networks without modern transport. A history we've been systematically taught to forget. The question isn't whether this world existed. The evidence is overwhelming, physical, impossible to ignore. The question is why we're so determined not to see it. Why acknowledging 19th century sophistication threatens our modern identity. Why insist everything before us was primitive and backward? Why can't we accept that knowledge sometimes gets lost, civilizations sometimes forget, progress isn't always linear? What are we protecting by upholding the official narrative? And more unsettling, what else have we forgotten? What other capabilities existed that we can no longer recognize? What other systems worked that we've trained ourselves not to notice? The buildings stand, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Infrastructure remains silent testimony to knowledges we've lost. Photographs preserve moments from a world we claim never existed. But it did exist. People lived in it, worked in it, moved through it daily, built lives within systems we've convinced ourselves were impossible. Somewhere in archives, basement vaults, forgotten engineering journals, the documentation waits. Evidence accumulates. The pattern becomes undeniable. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The only remaining question is whether we're ready to look. This investigation continues. Archives are deep, evidence vast, questions multiply. Because the deeper we look, the more convinced we become that history is not what we've been told, and that the truth may be what we've been forgetting all along.